Happy July 4th weekend, everybody. Hope you have had a great one so far. Thanks for joining us for online church today. I'm going to begin a brand new series called The Most Excellent Way in just a few moments, looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter. But before we do that, we have a few announcements and we're going to worship together. See you in just a few moments.
Surely it was through, but since when has impossible ever stopped me? Friday's disappointment and Sunday's empty too, but since when has impossible ever stopped me? This is the sound of dry bones rattling. This is the praise, make a dead man walk again. Open the grave, I'm coming out. I'm gonna live again. This is the sound of dry bones rattling. Pentecostal fire, stirring something new. You're not gonna run out of miracles anytime soon. Yeah, resurrection power runs in my veins too. Yeah, I believe there's another miracle here in this room. This is the sound of dry bones rattling. This is the praise, make a dead man walk again. Open the grave, I'm coming out. I'm gonna live again. This is the sound of dry bones rattling.
Well, happy 4th of July weekend, everyone. I'm Nate, one of the pastors here at the church at RB. Thank you so much for joining us today. I don't know about you, but it seems like every single day things are changing in our world, and we are constantly having to adapt to these changes in our workplaces, at our schools, and even in our communities. Well, here at the church, we are adapting as well. However, ministry has never been put on pause. In fact, it's in fast forward, and we are serving and engaging more and more people in our community, more than ever before. And we just want you to know that we are here for you. If you've been looking for connection or if you need help, we want you to know that we have a counseling team that is here for you. We provide free biblical counseling. And if you're feeling isolated, we have groups we can connect you with, so please don't hesitate to reach out. Well, one of the things I love most about this church is your generosity. And it's because of your financial gifts that we were able to provide additional support to our sister church in South Africa by purchasing some food for their local community. Well, it's so cool to see how your generosity is changing people's lives in our local neighborhoods and also throughout the world. Thank you for your continued giving. And if you are in a position to give, we want to invite you to do so. You can go to crb.gives to make a contribution. Well, next up, Jared will begin a brand new series called The Most Excellent Way.
Well, hey everybody, welcome back. I cannot wait to begin this brand new series with you today called The Most Excellent Way, looking at 1 Corinthians 13 over the next few weeks. Before we get going, in October of 1991, not only did my beloved Atlanta Braves lose their very first World Series of the 90s, but a storm called the Perfect Storm, if you remember the movie with George Clooney, hit off the coast of New England. And the movie is about a boat called the Andrea Gale that was out at sea and was essentially reduced to matchsticks. But the reason it was called the Perfect Storm is because there was a convergence of three events. In meteorology, this is a pretty rare phenomenon. And essentially what it was the convergence of was a cold front that came in, a high pressure system, and this is about all I know about meteorology, and that combined, and really what was the gasoline on the fire was a hurricane. Hurricane Grace came in and combined with the cold pressure and with the cold front and with the high pressure system and produced, those three factors produced the perfect storm. And I say that today, not for a weather lesson, but I say that because really what we're living in the middle of right now in the United States, it's a perfect storm. You feel it from every which way. You have the convergence really of three factors that have made, there was an article written this past week that said that America has turned into a giant anger incubator. And you probably feel that at 1,000 levels today. These convergence of events that have produced really this anger incubator that we live in. At one level, you have the civil unrest around the death of George Floyd. At another level, you have the economic fallout that has happened with the jobless rate headed in the wrong direction, the stalling of global markets. At the same time, you have the pandemic. And these three events, and depending on your stage of life, one of those may be closer to you, but all of them have affected you. All of them have affected me. And you know this is true. Friendships have ended. You probably find yourself in that situation trying to navigate. How serious are they taking coronavirus? Should I wear a mask around them? Why don't they wear a mask? Friendships have ended. Families are in tension. You maybe even found yourself canceling 4th of July barbecue plans because you just didn't want to be around anybody this year. In more ways than ever, it is a red hot summer in the United States. And I say that today not to offer any solutions, but to do what we always do around here, which is to turn back into the scriptures and to look at what the New Testament offers us It's really what I believe, what Paul says is the most excellent way. If you go back 2,000 years, Paul, who wrote a majority of the New Testament, wrote a letter to a group of people in a place called Corinth. And Corinth was a unique place 2,000 years ago. It's unique today because it's one of the few places where you read these letters in the New Testament that you can actually still go to this very day. Corinth is still on the map. It's in Greece, where it was 2,000 years ago. And Paul was a church planner. And Paul goes to Corinth and starts a church there. And he does it almost exactly 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And he shows up into what Corinth was a crowning jewel in the Roman Empire. It was a very unique city in ancient Rome because it was very, very diverse. It was a port city, which meant you had a lot of people in and out. And most places in the Roman Empire, you lived with people who looked like you, talked like you, economically were like you. But that was not true in Corinth. It was very diverse. Racially, economically, socially, it was all across the board. And Paul shows up there and announces resurrection, announces that the tomb is empty. And he starts a church and he does what he always did. He would go on to the next place. Well, he gets to the next place after starting the church in Corinth, and word gets to him. He's in Ephesus, which is where we get the letter Ephesians. And when he gets to Ephesus, he gets word that the church in Corinth is having some problems. A lot of the cultural issues have seeped into the church. And so Paul is going to write them this letter, 1 Corinthians, to help them untangle the storm, the hairball, the situation, the tension that they are in the middle of. And just to give you a little window into some of the problems that the church at Corinth is having, and if you want to just feel better about yourself, just go read the book 1 Corinthians. I mean, they could not see straight. They were so backwards in their thinking and behavior. One issue that they had was around communion. And in the first century world, communion was not just like a little wafer and a little cup that you would take. It was a meal. And in Corinth, what was happening was the rich people were getting to the church first because they didn't have to work, and they were eating all the food and they were drinking all the wine. And Paul is writing them saying, you got to stop doing that, because the poor people were angry because they had to work. They would get there for communion. All the food was gone. All the wine was gone. All the rich people were, partying it up. And so Paul writes them, and you can read this in 1 Corinthians, to say, hey, get the cash bar out of the church. And I'm not quite sure, what the pastor of the church thought. Maybe, let people get drunk, tithes will go up, jokes will be funnier. But, this was an issue that they had. They were sleeping with temple prostitutes in the church. This was a huge issue. And so Paul is essentially writing them to say, hey, Corinth, clean up your act. And what they were doing was they were arguing over, well, who's right, who's wrong in the church, in culture. And Paul writes them and says something in the middle of this letter to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians, in describing the lens that he wants them to view their reality through. And I think it's the lens that he wants us to view our reality through. And he says this, after sort of giving them a hard time and saying, hey, knock it off, knock it off, knock it off. He says, let me show you higher ground. He says this, and yet I will show you the most excellent way. And what he's doing here is he's setting up 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which, even if you're not a Christian, you probably are somewhat familiar with it. If you've ever been to a wedding before, you've read 1 Corinthians 13, or you've heard it read at a wedding. It's the love chapter. It's the love poem. But before it was read to couples at their wedding, it was read to the church at Corinth, and it was for them, and it's for you, and it's for me. And essentially what Paul is doing is he's saying, instead of arguing over who's right, who's wrong, instead of arguing over who's more spiritual, I want you to view your current reality through the lens of love. It is the most excellent way. And so for the next few weeks, what I want to do is I want to take 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And for us, how helpful would this be as we look at the perfect storm that we're in the middle of? And we began to view our circumstances and our neighbors through the lens of love. If you have a Bible, turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If you don't have a Bible, that's okay. You can just follow along on the screens. Let's look at the most excellent way together. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, starting in verse 1. This is Paul to the church. You probably have heard this before. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels. He's talking about spiritual gifts here. But I do not have love. I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I'm just making some noise. He says, if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, he says, come on, I'm nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor, which you would hear that and say, well, that's a really good thing to do. And I give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but I do not have love. Corinth, United States. He says, I gain nothing. And what Paul is doing here is he's reminding them of what has always been at the top of the agenda for Christians. It's love. And it was Jesus. I mean, if you go back to the Gospels, it's love that was the primary motivator. It was love that God was constantly consumed with as he sent his son into this world. John 3:16, the most famous passage. You've seen it at football games. For God so loved the world. Remember what we talk about around here all the time, the greatest commandment, love God and love your neighbor. It's like the double love commandment. And before Jesus, love was not talked about in the way that it is now. Part of the confusion we have around the word love is that everybody uses that. I'm going to talk about it in just a moment. But when Jesus comes into this world, he really single-handedly puts love on the map. No philosophers were talking about love before Jesus. Certainly no emperors. It was not really even a religious concept. He sort of rescued it from the Torah. It sort of took it out of the 613 laws, and he puts it as primary. He says, this is what you need to major in. And Paul's essentially looking at a church that was very, if you read the letter, they were very spiritually gifted. They could prophesy. They could speak in tongues. Socially, they were giving to the poor. But he says, look, if love's not the thing, then you sort of miss the point of the whole thing. That has to be the thing that you do everything through. If you are really wise and you know all the scriptures, Paul says, but you don't have love, well, you sort of miss the whole thing. If you can speak in tongues and you are very expressive and you're very gifted, but you don't have love, well, you've sort of missed the whole thing. And then he says this, and this one's sort of odd to us, isn't it? He says, if you give everything to the poor, which you and I would look at and say, well, that is an act of love. Certainly, Paul says, if you do that, but you don't have love, which, how's that possible? Paul says, well, you've sort of missed the whole thing. If you excel in, maybe in our language, in our world, Paul would say, hey, if you excel in Christian values, you make sure you don't watch the wrong movies, you make sure you don't say the wrong words, you don't say bad words, you're kind of a good moral person, but you fail at love, well, you sort of miss the point of the whole thing. You've majored in the minors and you've minored in the majors. Love is the most excellent way. And what does he mean by this? If you give all your money to the poor, but you don't have love, what have you gained, Paul says? You've gained nothing. And what he's doing here is he's really pinpointing something that is so deep in you and it is so deep in me that we do everything for our own gain. We do everything for our own benefit. It's almost impossible to do anything without thinking about the benefit that we get from it. For example, if I gave money to my kids, and if you said, well, why did you give money to your kids? My immediate response would be, well, because I love my kids. But at the same time, there's a part of it in giving money to my kids or buying them things, I'm trying to keep them close to me. I want them to like me. I want them to validate me. If I give them money for college, you say, why'd you do that? Well, because I love them and I support them. But at the same time, if they look good, I look good. There's always a gain in it for us. And Paul's essentially saying, if you do it for gain, it loses the ability to be called love. How Paul is going to define love. We're going to look at that in just a moment. And essentially, here's what he's doing. This is where it maybe gets a little bit offensive. So much of what we do in our culture, our society, in the name of love, Paul's saying, and he's really talking to the church at Corinth here, you do it in the name of control. You want to appear a certain way. You want to control a group of people. You love them because they love you. That it's sort of baked into our love that we're trying to control. And if that's the case, well, it ceases to be love the way that Paul is defining it the most excellent way. If you keep drilling down on this, he's really pinpointing, and we're going to talk more about this next week. There is a design flaw in you, and there is a design flaw in me. See, there's something in you, and there is something in me. We expect from other people what we cannot give ourselves. We expect, to be very clear, unconditional love from other people. That's what we want. That's our heart's greatest need. And yet at the same time, isn't it true? It's impossible to give. We expect somebody to love us without the pursuit of gain. They're not loving us because they're trying to get something. If you overhear two people in a coffee shop and they're talking about a breakup, well, why did you break up with him? Why did you break up with her? It's because, well, he didn't love me for me. She didn't love me for me. Our heart's greatest desire is to be loved unconditionally. Somebody would show up and love us without gain. They're not trying to get something. And yet at the same time, here's the design flaw, the sinful nature is what the scriptures would call it. It's impossible to give that. You might say, well, I love my spouse unconditionally. But I mean, come on, be honest. If your spouse said to you, look, I'm not going to contribute anything to this marriage. I'm not even that interested in this marriage. In fact, I'm just going to kind of lay on the couch. You're on your own raising the kids or whatever it is. Be honest. You would not be in love tomorrow. You would be in counseling. It's impossible. It's how in the world do you give that kind of love to somebody? We expect what we cannot seem or find in our hearts to give. And I'm going to talk more about this next week because the only place, that thing in you that wants unconditional love, is the thing that drives you into the arms of Jesus ultimately. Because he is the one source where you find the stamp of approval, where you find unconditional love. And when you experience that and it rattles down deep in your bones, you are now free to go into the world and love in the most excellent way that Paul is talking about, without gain. You're free to love in a way that is biblical love. And the Bible encourages us to love differently than the world loves. Culture's view of love and the Bible's view of love are very, very different. And it's part of the confusion. If I said, hey, you need to love people, everybody says, well, of course. Every nonprofit, every organization puts love at the top of its agenda because Judeo-Christian values are so baked into our culture and society. But the culture loves differently than the Bible is telling us to love. This kind of love, in the culture that we live in our world, C.S. Lewis said it this way several years ago in the Screw Tape Letters. He said that I feign to say that what we call love is actually just hunger. Our culture's view of love, it's our ego hungering for something. To be more specific, what he means by that is if I say to you, I love you, what I really mean is I love that you love me. You satisfy a hunger in me. You believe like I do. You like what I like. You give me what I gain from this relationship. And when you open up the scriptures and you see what Paul means by love, how Jesus lives out and defines love, it's very, very different than that. And in the scriptures, and here's the heart of it today, man. In the scriptures, love is not something you scream into a microphone. Love is not something you say when you hang up the phone call. All that's fine and good. Love is the question you ask in private at the table when you don't understand. Love is the relationship that you build when you only see potential loss in it for you and you cannot find gain. Love is not an emotion that you feel and butterflies in your stomach. Love is an action that you do for the benefit of somebody else. At its most basic level in the scriptures, love is evidence. In Galatians chapter 5, love is evidence that the Spirit of God, the unconditional love of God, has taken up root in you. It's fruit that you see, that something has happened on the inside of you. And if all that sounds esoteric and vague, and you say, well, that's just kind of big, lofty terms for love, Paul gets really, really practical in verses 4-7 about how he describes and how we should proceed in the most excellent way of loving people. And I just want us to I'm going to give you 3 questions today that are just practical, specific questions to ask yourself, and they're a framework for how, as the people of God, as Christians, we are to love one another. Notice what Paul says. Verse 4, love is patient, which right there, I'm out. I hope my kids don't hear this sermon. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It's not pursuing gain. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, Paul says, but it rejoices with the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always, come on, how good is this? It always perseveres. He goes on, we're going to look more at this in the coming weeks. It never fails, Paul says. Even in the perfect storm, even when you don't know what to say, you don't know what to do, you don't know how to navigate the circumstances, love is always the lens and the framework that you should have. If we get really, really practical, because you might hear that and say, well, that sounds vague and esoteric. What does that mean? Let's get very, very specific here. Here's what he says in the passage. He says, love protects. Did you catch that? He says, love protects. That love looks out at somebody who's vulnerable. Love looks out at somebody who's hurting. Love looks out at somebody who feels like they're suffering for whatever reason. It could be because of their pre-existing conditions. It could be because of their age. It could be because of economic conditions. It could be because of job loss. It could be because of their skin color. But love looks out at somebody who's hurting and says, I want to protect, even though there's no benefit in it for me. Essentially, you could think of it this way. What love will do, and this is how Paul's essentially, if you start fleshing this out, love has the ability to say, I will loan you my strength, but I am not going to remind you of your weaknesses. Love says, I'm going to look at you and your circumstances, your situation, whatever it is, when you're hurting, when you're suffering, and I am going to loan you my strength. And at the same time, and here's really the catch, I'm not going to remind you of your weaknesses. That love protects. It's the most excellent way. Wouldn't it be powerful if you were loved like that? Wouldn't it be even more powerful if you could love like that? Maybe here's the question to ask yourself. This is kind of the litmus test. Do I spend more time, and this is really for me more than it's for you, do I spend more time pointing out weaknesses in others or loaning my strength to others? It's easy to point out weaknesses, isn't it? It's easy to look out at somebody and see their faults. It's harder with our mouths closed, without an open hand to get something or gain something, to loan our strength to somebody. But Paul says that is the most excellent way. You keep reading in this. Notice what he says. He pinpoints a tension here of love. He says love is patient and it's truth-telling. It rejoices in the truth, Paul says, but at the same time, he says love is patient and love is kind. You can feel the tension in those two. That they feel like they're in opposition to each other. And there's probably a camp of you out there that would say, well, it's easy for me to be patient and kind. On the other side of the coin, there's probably a camp of you out there that would say, well, it's easy for me to be a truth teller. And in fact, it's my spiritual gift to go around telling everybody everything they're doing wrong and to confront people. You probably find one of these easier than the other. You probably veer towards one or the other. It's hard to hold them together at the same time, being a person who's patient and kind and a person who can speak the truth. But that's what love does. What does Jesus do when he comes into this world? John says he comes with grace and truth. He doesn't lean too far in the direction. He doesn't ignore truth for grace or grace for truth. And Paul says the same thing is true about the nature of love. If you veer too hard in the direction of being patient and kind, and you have a hard time telling people the truth, or speaking up when you see something you need to say something about, it probably means you desperately need somebody's approval. On the other side of the coin, if you find yourself constantly raging and it's easy for you to tell people the truth and be confrontational, you probably desperately need to be right. And love finds the ability, grace and truth, patience and kindness, and telling the truth. It's easy, especially in the world we live in, to begin to mistake an elevated pulse for the presence of the Holy Spirit. And to think, well, you know what? The truth is on my side. I know I'm right. I'm going to say it. It's harder to be patient and kind if you're wired that way. But listen, here's what Paul says. Truth or love has this ability. And this is maybe the good question to ask yourself. Can I speak up to someone? Because love will always do that, without talking down to someone at the same time. Love navigates those two. Truth-telling and patience and kindness. There's nothing to gain in that, but if it's for gain, well, it ceases to be love. It's no longer the most excellent way. You keep going in this passage, and you could really make a long list, but I just want to give you 3 really practical ones today. He says this about love. He says, love trusts. Love trusts, which is so hard to do. Come on, let's be honest. It's hard to do in your marriage. It's hard to do with your kids. It's certainly hard to do with a body of people. It's hard to do as you sort of look out at the world. But the presence of love means there's the presence of trust, which right now, this is kind of the difficult thing, isn't it? When you don't understand somebody, when you don't, kind of get where they're coming from, what your tendency and what my tendency is to do is to fill in the gaps of what we don't understand or what we don't know about somebody with our worst possible suspicions about somebody. And we'll fill in the gaps with our worst possible suspicions. And listen, you have left the lane of the most excellent way of love when your heart is dominated by suspicion instead of trust. And wouldn't it be incredible if in your own heart, you became the kind of person who, instead of walking into situations suspicious, you walked into situations filled with trust? That's what love does. That's what love requires of us. Maybe this is the question to ask. Do I fill in the gaps of what I don't know about you with my worst suspicions of you? Love always places trust over suspicions. It's the most excellent way to live, according to Paul. It is the best way. It is the anchor in the storm. And over the next few weeks, we're going to continue to unpack this together and ask ourselves these questions. Are we the kind of people who find our feet in these days on the most excellent way? And aren't you glad? Aren't you glad? When God looked at you and when God looked at me, he chose the most excellent way on the cross, the way of love, so that you and I could find our way into the arms of the Father. Let's pray together. Jesus, we thank you today that you look at us today, not with suspicion. You look at us today for what we are, people trying to do our best, trying to navigate the storm of life. And God, I thank you that you came into this world. What an enormous act of trust that you would send your son into this world, and you would also send your spirit into this world. You left a lot hanging in the balance. That is an enormous act of trust today. And God, here we are in this world. As Paul says, we can't see clearly. But would you give us wisdom today? Would you give us courage today? Would you give us the ability in the middle of what often is confusing, in a year where Seems like nothing seems to make sense. Would you give us a framework and a lens to find the most excellent way forward in these days? Would you give us the courage to love where it's easier to be suspicious? Would you give us the courage to love where it's easier to not do so? Would we be the people of God who watch heaven crash into earth, not just one day, but in the here and now? Would your kingdom come? Would your will, love be done on earth as it is in heaven? It's in Jesus' name that we pray, and all of God's children said, amen. Grace and peace.
I survey the wonderful cross on which the Prince of Glory died. My richest gain I count but a loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. If such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown. Oh, the wonderful cross. Oh, the wonderful cross bids me come and die and find that I will truly live. Oh, the wonderful cross. Oh, the wonderful cross. Oh, who gather here by grace draw near and bless your name. And were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Oh, the wonderful cross. Oh, the wonderful cross bids me come and die and find that I will truly live. Oh, the wonderful cross. Oh, the wonderful cross. Oh, who draw near and bless your name. And oh, the wonderful cross, oh, the wonderful cross bids me come and die and find that I will truly live. Oh, the wonderful cross, oh, the wonderful cross, oh, who gather here by grace draw near, bless your name.
Happy 4th of July weekend, church. We kicked off an amazing weekend with 2 drive-in church services, one for CRB kids and one for our middle school and high schoolers. Check it out.
A VBS focus, take a closer look, is kind of what we did this week, right? We focused, we slowed down, we took a closer look, and we realized just how big and mighty our God is.
To me, driving church means it's just kind of a way that we can all connect at church, but staying far apart and safe.
It's just fun to hang out with friends and just see people that you haven't gotten to see in a while.
This week we caught up with Wally Dickinson, who leads the prayer quilt ministry here at the church. Check out how these quilts offer hope to people who are experiencing health challenges.
The prayer quilt ministry is all about making a quilt, praying over it, and giving it to somebody that needs a prayer. People need to be praying more for other people. Right now, we are all so shut in, especially us older ladies and gentlemen, that we need lots of prayers to keep us going, keep our faith, and give us hope.
If you have stories to share or want to get involved, visit thechurchrv.org/forourneighbors for more information. Thanks for sharing your hearts, sending in your stories, and being good neighbors with us and for the community. Have a great week. Thanks for tuning in for Church at Home. Here are a few ways to stay engaged and spiritually connected. We believe giving is an act of worship just like singing, praying, or serving others. Giving is a way to express our love for God. If you're in a position to give, we invite you to visit crb.gives for simple and secure giving. Have you downloaded our app yet? It's for more than just Sunday. Listen to worship music, watch midweek content, and much more. Thanks for watching.